boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today a political and economic writer. He's a specialist on China, speaks Chinese, lived in China, studied in China, has a podcast called China Unraveled, and is currently in the works of producing a book on China itself. I want to introduce to you today Jason Szetful. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So basically, they adopted a more Western approach on the look of land. But if there's private use of land, though, it's considered not private technically. So you said you had all these apartments lined up in the middle of nowhere, and nothing around them. And what's the economic drive to build that, or is that a state thing? Explain that part.
Right. So the way there's a lot of different pieces to it, but the state thing in this is that just developing stuff, just making things, like GDP is a measure of like activity in a lot of ways, right? Just activity. So there's a lot of things you can do. People always joke about like digging a hole and then like covering up the hole and then like redigging the hole. But in China, often you just want activity. You just need things to happen. And so on the state side, the deep down sort of public or state ownership of all this land has been good for China because it's allowed them to say, hey, all you peasants and villagers and fishermen around Shanghai, you're all out of here, and we're going to build like a giant business district, right? So it's allowed them to. That's why China can build all sorts of stuff. Like if you want to build a power line through Wyoming and in a couple other states, good luck. That's like 12 years. Every single farmer, every single person, every single utility, every single special district, everything is going to fight you along the way. In China, they build a giant road and they just move everybody out, right? That's how. Like later. So again, this is like, people ask me like, oh, like, well, if China was like Western and blah, 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 and more democratic, would it have developed? It's like, no, like this is for China to develop the way it developed. It needed to be the kind of state it is in the world it lived in. So it got the benefits of its state system, and it had the example of the United States and Japan and Germany, and it had the free trade, global inputs world that the United States was fostering. So it developed in this very special moment where it could sort of bring all these pieces together, right? And that's what happened. But yeah, to the question of our apartment forest, it's like often you want to hit some numbers at the end of the month, kind of like you need to hit your numbers, and you say, well, we don't have exactly a giant plan for this region, but let's just, here, you can have it, and I'll get a little of this, I'll get a little of that. But in general, they have master plan developments. They have all sorts of development that is trying to be increasingly sophisticated, but there's also just like,
well, I'm wondering if there's like because when I see something like that, I instantly think the government was behind it in any nation, especially my own, right? And if there's something crazy like that is there like was it like some incentive from the party saying, hey, we need this many more apartments, we'll subsidize you if you can build them, and the developer just built them to get the money, though nobody got the apartments? Is it kind of like that?
Well, so often, like, let's say you and I developed a building in Beijing, right? You and I, we were partners in this development. We were doing it. It's not uncommon for the ownership of that building to change hands like 10, 15, 20 times during the process, just while it's being developed, and they put things up quick. So there's a lot of velocity to this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people, and the way it works for the incentives, it's not the government will say build more houses. It'll be the government will say you need to hit X growth number. And like I was saying, the construction development, that really boosts all that, whether it's real growth that pans out in the long term, that kind of stuff. But just building stuff is really good. It's got employment. It's got all the subsidiary industries, the concrete, the heavy industry, all that is all kind of used in it. And that's why it's so popular in China's development model. But that's kind of the way things go. And
I think I'm kind of catching on. So creating work for work's sake, creating activity for activity's sake, though you don't necessarily get an economic benefit by the work itself, other than the people put the work. Is it sort of like that? Like
it's
make big rocks into little rocks type of activity? Or
it's build real stuff. It's more like think about it more. It's like, let's keep the production lines up, right?
Yeah.
Like we used to, let's say there's a F-15 fighter line somewhere in, I don't know, St. Louis or something, right? Okay. Well, we don't really need any more F-15s, but let's just build a lot more, right? we let's just build them, right? And it sounds funny when you apply it to like construction, but because like if you were a private developer and you're like, well, there's no people for this, that could be a bit of a problem. But often, like in China, things that you'd like write off, you're like, that didn't work for my business. Like I lost a lot of money on it. They don't write it off. Is another way to think about it. Like they're just like, look at all that with all that work we did, built all this stuff. And then, or all that stuff we produce.
Yeah.
Here's another way to think about it. Like, that Belt and Road Initiative? You heard about that? Sort of this Chinese plan to like build roads and ports and stuff all around the world.
Infrastructure they were wanting to build everywhere.
Yeah. Well, you can also think about it's like, well, we tapped out the infrastructure in China, but we want to keep all these production lines up. Yeah, exactly. That is a big part of what's going on.
Wow.
Because, and it's especially since 2008, this is when this went crazy. China has pushed this development model like far beyond any other country. Like it's been investing like, I don't know, 8% of GDP like into infrastructure for so long. And it's like like I said, China has so many challenges that it needed this infrastructure. It needed a lot of it.
Yeah.
But you need to have outcomes. Like you need to have sort of self-sustaining high income activity that goes on to justify all this stuff afterwards, right? Like this is why in the US in particular, where we've had a lot of painful lessons when we try to do this stuff and didn't work. But in China, there's no business cycles. This is also another thing.
Right.
There hasn't been a real business cycle in China since the 1990s. Yeah, there's been like other stuff, but not like you really see in other places. So there's no experience with this stuff. And it's just been the government, like we said earlier, it relies on its performance and its legitimacy. It relies on these economic growth numbers. It relies on this visual presentation of all the stuff it's doing.
Yeah, so we'll just keep building longbows, even though we have the machine gun, just because we have people making longbows. I mean, it's sort of like that in a way. But it seems again to echo the whole the modern monetary theory of of economics. That if because to me the problem with that theory is you can fool yourself with numbers that things are well and still be lacking in goods and services. But if the numbers look good, you can say, look, the economic performance is looking good, despite the fact on the ground, things are kind of weird and haywire. It's almost like this in itself it's like another bubble. Besides the real estate, to me, this looks like another bubble that's bound to burst.
And do you mean by bubble bound to burst, do you mean the fiscal debt of countries or
a debt, but as far as how long can you provide for economic activity for its own sake and it not really contribute to an actual economy before you burst?
Yeah, that stuff doesn't work. Like we said earlier, you ideally in a ideal world, you'd have a currency and debt levels that match the economic activity or the expectation of future economic activity. It's actually not that complicated. We live in a world we've made it extremely complicated, and the lack of inflation for the last 15 years at least has really twisted some people's ideas about how economics might work and how things might work. But we're starting to get a sense that the world is rapidly changing this decade, and there's a whole lot of structural changes that are happening that we're not talking about, and that we're talking about these abstractions. Modern monetary theory
abstractions.
Instead. Yeah, it's like I'm 100% on the team of like, if you want to look at the economy, learn about how the pieces work. How is this thing made? How is steel made? How is this put here? How does this add up to this? And then at the end, you bean count. Right. Yeah, that's the end thing. We were like bean counting and then like saying, oh, but what's going on in the real world, right? Like afterwards. And that's a mixed way to do it. But I mean, some real important things that are happening is the global population, and particularly in the advanced world, is declining. You probably heard about this.
That's right.
And this is like, what you'll see is you see like an article about this, it'll be like the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, something. They'll be like, and demographic, and there'll be like a whole article about how things are bad because there's not enough people. At the end, they say, and this could have systematic changes to the world or something. And they just leave it at that. They're like, all right, you've been saying that for like 10 years now, and those changes are upon us at this point. So just as an example, so since 1970, the United States, about half of U.S. economic growth has come from population growth. The other half has come from like productivity, doing things better, doing, roughly speaking, like more with less kind of thing. So, well, what happens if you take out half of
I
that
know
growth?
you affect half of the of the activity. Is
Yeah.
that and this isn't just a U.S. problem.
No.
Most Western nations, some more than others, are like suddenly going, uh-oh, because the whole systems are built upon the idea of people feeding it, and now you don't have them.
Yeah, just think about all these businesses like consumer packaged goods. Like, oh, we sell ketchup, we sell diapers, we sell all these things that basically, you got the adjustable market, and you have your share. You don't suddenly go 10x better than your competitors. You've been sitting the same numbers for years. You
Right.
all benefit when there's just more people to sell to.
That's right.
What if you all have less?
Yeah. So was this an effect then, perhaps, in China regarding its one child policy for so long that I think they recently allowed you to have an extra, but people still aren't doing it anyway? Is that causing what could be big issues down the road for China?
We haven't even talked about this, but behind the scenes, the one child policy was
Yeah.
like the most, maybe, it's really pushing for one of the most catastrophic things that China has coming. Because, well, just think about it. If you can only have one child since, or basically, the early 80s, roughly speaking,
Yes.
that was really enforced, you're running out of people. Right. And they've been basically lying about their population. Like, so we could get into it, but the Chinese population is smaller than it's actually stated, almost certainly. And they have sex imbalances. They have a lot of problems that come with this. And what the core thing, kind of to what you're saying, is yes, this basically kind of makes it impossible to have the consumer economy that China has been saying it will move to for the
Right.
last like 15 years. Right. So we were talking about how they build stuff. It's all about throughput, build more, build more, build more, build more, keep it
Right.
going, keep it running, add another
Right.
production line. Here we go.
And now there's no people.
Right. Well, so there's that. They got that.
Yeah.
They got this
Yeah.
heavy industry, build more ports, build more this, more that. And then they got the exports. And they've been saying for a long time, to rebalance the Chinese economy, we're going to move to a consumer economy like the US, right? Where it's not like, the US doesn't grow every year unless, you have financial bubbles in the subprime market or whatever, because you're building more homes. It's like a broad-based thing. It's kind of responding to consumer desires. And
That's right.
it's a kind of organic thing.
Yeah.
China's been saying they're going to do that, but they're in this decade, and particularly in the 2030s, they're going to hit the fact that they ran out of young people. Right. And so they have very high octane growth now because, it's like, everybody, they're buying the people, the generation is in that age where they're buying everything and they're buying this and they're buying that and they're buying that. But then they don't have kids. They don't have this. They don't actually move into that next stage.
That's right.
Where they contribute in the next level to the economy. So it's basically impossible for China to have the sort of consumer economy it would need, at least domestically. Right. So what it means to have an export economy is, hey, we sell to consumers elsewhere. Right. That's what that means. So if you're Germany, if you're Japan in a lot of ways, if you're Taiwan, if you're China, you sell particularly to the United States. You take advantage of their consumers and reinvest in your economy, and you slowly build it up and hopefully develop your own consumer base, right? But unfortunately, this demographic problem is making that impossible. So all these countries, the only countries that have developed really since 1945, did something called export-led industrialization. Basically, they used exports, just like we're talking about, export to some country. Start with little radios, little crappy things, and then you eventually move up. Right. And ideally, they wanted to sell to their own people. But Japan really showed. And now South Korea is even worse. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate of anything ever. And they're never going to be able to sell to their own people because they don't have enough. And this is the same thing with Japan. And Japan actually is wealthy enough that it can deal with this. Like we were talking about, they succeeded. They reached the point early enough, and look, I mean, they've been like in a crisis since the 90s, but they're still around. They're not like falling into the sea. This is just another area where the scale of China's problem is so immense. How do you keep everything running if you can't sell to other people around the world and you have not even close to the number of people you need, again, for the level of production you have? This circle cannot be squared, right? The square peg doesn't fit in the circular hole. Like, I don't know how many ways to say that, but this is one of those key ones. Like, we can talk about the finance and the super overcapitalized, credit drenched, debt drenched society, all that kind of stuff. But this demographic thing is really at the core of some of the challenges China faces because it's tapped out this export model. It's like you build roughly a third of all the you assemble at least third of all the manufactured goods in the world. Well, there's 0% chance you can consume a third of the manufactured manufactured goods of the world. Yeah, it ain't gonna happen. So basically what's happened is since 2012-ish, the Chinese state has been saying, all right, we're gonna start lowering the debt, stop focusing on construction and stop that and stop the exports and focus on the consumer stuff within China. And then every time they get a little dip in growth, they're like, no, we're back. Like, because they're trying to keep it all up. They don't want the show. They don't want the party to stop.
Right.
And that has what that's done is behind the scenes. It's just been building up worse and worse. This is how you get 50 trillion in the property market, right? This is how you build up to where when you finally say, oh, okay, we're transitioning to the consumer economy, you're like, our millennials are like 40 now, and there's no one after them.
That's crazy. I mean, I don't know. To me, it just highlights just the madness of this top-down model, because the goal was to limit the population, to decrease it. That was the actual goal. They accomplished it. But now it's like you have to deal with the consequence of what you mobilize a whole nation to do this big task. You accomplish it. And now it's like, because I've noticed with some articles and sometimes I watch like commercials or just, like I said, things in movies, they seem to be pushing this whole childhood thing more, wanting women to be mothers, to be at home, which was not a communist thing back in the day. Now it seems like they're kind of trying to emphasize that more, I guess, for the birth rate thing. This is probably a bigger problem than they're letting on to, and that maybe a lot of people realize.
Oh yeah. And so just to kind of tie it back to China, like throughout history.
Yeah.
Basically what happens when a new empire comes together is they typically have like roughly speaking, a breed for the motherland program. Like, we want more people. It'll make everything easier. We'll have more soldiers, more farmers, more merchants, everything. So you have more. And actually Mao in the 1950s basically did that. He was like, well, the US is just going to nuke us, but we're going to have so many people. They won't even matter.
They can't get them all.
Yeah, you can't nuke us all. That was basically his strategy. But in the 1970s, they basically realized that if they didn't lower the population, they would never be able to develop. And so I believe that the one-child policy was super heinous. It was a pretty despicable thing from what anyone who grew up in the West and has basic thoughts about human decency and liberal and rights and anything would believe, right? That's true. But that being said, it also helped them to develop. That's a fact. That you prevented 300 million additional people, roughly speaking, from joining your country and adding to the needs that it had. Because remember, they wouldn't be workers, right? They would be babies that you had to take care of at that stage, right? You only get the benefit of them, 2010-ish, 2005, whatever it was. But until then, they were a burden. And the challenge for not even just state planning, but in general, this is one of those government things where it's very hard to change tack, right? You could think, for example, in Western nations during the pandemic, to be nimble and responsive to the changing virus has been basically impossible for most countries. It's been very difficult. Messaging has been poor. The communication has been poor. All this is poor. And you feel like, well, why are they still talking like we're dealing with something like it's spring of 2020? It's now a different thing. And then in China, you just get the super version of this where it's like, why are you still preventing births when you have no people? You have no babies, right? And you're right. They have been here's an even creepier thing. Basically, they have family planning clinics across China. This was part of the one-child policy. And basically, they were like state-run abortion clinics, roughly speaking. And there are nurses that their whole career was like aborting 40, 50, 60,000 children, fetuses. That was what it was. And now these family planning clinics are being converted into like IVF clinics, right? That's quite literally what's happening. And I know it's so ironic you can't even handle it, but that's the way it's going. And China right now is really going to struggle because it's been telling women for decades, don't have children, focus on work and all this. And now they're gonna have to say, all right, ladies, it's time for you to find a husband and do all this. But the truth is, it doesn't even matter. The way this works is millennials are roughly speaking in their 30s now, and female fertility is Basically, the way it works is a woman is half as fertile at age 30 as she was in her 20s. A fourth is fertile at 35, an eighth as fertile at 40, and like a 12th and even more diminishing returns by 42 and up.
Right.
So millennials are going to have the children they're going to have, roughly speaking, in the next decade. And then you're stuck with what you have. That is your population. This is one of those problems that is so large, wide, you can't really solve it. So this is, even if China decided to put all the women in camps and have children,
which is not beyond the realm of possibility.
right. No, seriously, we could get into it, but the way that China would solve a lot of its problems are like increasingly ridiculous things. But unfortunately, it needs so many ridiculous things. Like, it's like, well, and the deep problem with this is also that women are essential to the current economic system. You can't just take them out, right? You actually require that activity, that input into the system to keep it functioning. So this is sort of the basic dilemma that's haunted the nations, since the late 20th century, where you've had these birth rates that have decreased, and it's become so impossible to have both children and to do everything else in the world for a lot of women that you just get no children, basically. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but solving this problem, just to give the lay of the land here, Russia, Iran, basically every authoritarian state you can find has been trying to deal with the problem of low fertility. Zero have found an answer.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
You're right. Well, Russia has been pushing the whole have children for the motherland approach. Just the same. I was thinking of them too when you brought it up. It's there's different approaches to solving, issues. It's crazy.
It's hard to convince a woman to care for something it's like a long responsibility for decades. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard sell. And
it's a hard sell when you come right out of since childbirth, they're taught this ideal. Don't have the kids. Go to work. Accomplish this.
Yeah.
And now you're just going to do a 180 and say, no, do this now. And as it's
absurd.
I imagine it's a crazy, like, what? Wait, that's a hard thing, especially when you've removed for you, even demonized having kids. That's probably the big backfire. You've demonized motherhood to the point where, in their mind, why would I want to do something you've painted as evil for all these years? Now you want me to do it. That's a hard sell, I think.
In China in particular, it's bordering on absurd, right? Like, how are you gonna flip the switch that quick? And also, camps. They don't have time. They don't.
Camps,
they don't have time. This is the deepest problem with China right now. They don't have the time to fix all this stuff. You don't have the time to have children and then wait 20 years for them to enter your economy. You don't have that time. And you have so many other things, whether it's agriculture or energy or property or finance more broadly, or your currency or your foreign conflicts. This is what's going on with China. And so when I kind of started out, I was saying, what I'm looking at is where things are going with China. Like what comes next is part of what I've been trying to get people to get a read on. And this is it. Like, the reason I focused on China, in addition to this long history and appreciation for it, is the world map has been played out, right? The great game of risk that all the nations and peoples have been trying to find different regions and see who comes out on top. This game is over. And the United States has come out on top. And this is obviously, people are like, oh my God, Jason, end of history and blah, 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 blah. And I don't even mean that. I just mean that quite literally, India and Brazil and all, like, these are a farce, right? The only country that ever really had the potential to sort of really challenge the United States was China. And I'm not here to be rah the United States. What I think this is showing us is that we need to figure out, what do you do when you're not competing? Like, what do you do? Do we just start navel gazing? Do you start just watching celebrity news all day long? This is really the real question. And it's a profound thing. And also, I am trying to communicate some of the profound insights and knowledge and stuff that China has acquired and over the years, because there's deep, profound things embedded in that sort of civilization. Forget the state and all that. That is, I'm often dragged into the geopolitical conversations of like, well, if a showdown happened right now, in near Japan. Like, well, how would this go down? It's like, all right, well, let's do this. But the truth is these problems with China, we touched on like 8 of them, right?
Yeah, I know.
There's probably like a couple dozen or something. They're so profound, and they're so deep, and they're so big, and they're all kind of coming at once. That it's hard to see where this goes. And unfortunately, when China cracks, which I think is inevitable. I mean, I
think so.
There's ways they could keep this up for a lot. We could talk about the surveillance state. We could talk about how they're using AI and they're doing population control measures with advanced technologies that no authoritarian state has ever been able to, never had access to.
Right.
But then again, like I've said since the beginning, the challenges the Chinese state have always been almost so much larger than most other states that even their super authoritarian states throughout history haven't been enough. And almost certainly this one also isn't enough.
Right.
But nonetheless, if the China does crack, well, a lot of things have to change, right? And at a basic level, Wall Street, so much of Wall Street is betting on China, like adding to the world and adding all these consumers and actually being an opportunity for all these products and all this and all that. When you actually realize that this most likely isn't going to happen, what's happened is that people won't accept this. They won't. It clouds and contorts and destroys too many optimistic financial accounts, basically. And it's hard for people to know what to do. It just feels like, well, everything's broken. It's the end of the world kind of thing. And, I'm trying to get to some of the stuff that we could talk about, like about what could happen. But that's what people got to get ready for, right? Because the whole U.S. military is preparing for China, preparing for a war with China, preparing for all this stuff. There's a bipartisan animus against China, right? A rare bipartisan
occurrence.
Hatred. Yeah. Right. And you're like, wow, I've talked to Democratic, liberal organizers in Atlanta, and we talk about China. They're like, no. Like, all of us got to get together and stop them. I've talked to, very conservative people from Alabama on podcasts who are the complete opposite. And then we start talking about China, like, yeah, we got to take them out, kind of thing. Like, there's something here, but the truth is, it's going to crack up, and when it does, we're going to be really confused about where to go next.
Well, that's for sure. And I guess that's probably one of my worries is authoritarian states that are cracking don't go away gracefully. They go away swinging, and they will fight to the death. That's just their mentality. They just I will not leave until you make me, and I will take everybody down with me if I go. That's how I see China. That they're cracking. Initially you can get the yay crack up, but that crack is going to affect and have worldwide repercussions. I think it's not going to be they got thrown out of power and now they're democracy all of a sudden. This is going to turn ugly, in my opinion, rather than it being just like a sunshine coming up sort of moment.
Yeah, no, everyone thinks, if the China disappeared, the great Satan, America's great Satan, the next evil empire will be gone, and it'll be roses and sunshine afterwards. Mm-hmm. No, it's like, that's not how it would be at all. And so you're right.
It could be gone. It's just that it's not just going to go away. It will be a major fight to remove it. It will have repercussions that are felt around the world, and I'm not talking about the gas went up. I mean, it's going to be some serious bloodshed, some fight. I wouldn't be surprised if nuclear weapons got launched, just to save face in the matter.
Well, the real question is, so internally to China, yes, there will be massive conflict and almost certainly a lot of bloodshed. It's very hard to look at any time in China's history where something like this has happened, and that hasn't happened. And if you have energy in particular challenges that happen, suddenly all those really fancy systems that keep everything together, they're gone. That's simple as that. So that is a challenge. But the real question is always like, well, how does this impact the rest of the world in terms of like a shooting war, or in terms of, well, maybe the Chinese state lashes out externally to deal with its internal challenges or whatever. And there's a lot of reasons that could happen. But also, the Chinese military hasn't actually fought a war at all since 1979. I mean, this is basically a military that hasn't been used in half a century, and it's extraordinarily corrupt. It is not like the U.S. military, and there's a lot. It's a political organization, and then the real question is, the Chinese Communist Party relies on authority and legitimacy and competence, and it can't lose wars. That's a great way to be knocked out right away.
That's right.
All right. You went and like failed to take Taiwan. Really? Are you really? That basically means you're not the ruler of China, like just on their own conception, right?
Yes.
That's the last remaining piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
We gotta pull this all together. And if they fail, that is, well, I mean, it leads to bad things. So this is one sort of limiting factor on potential.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah.
External.
I agree. They have military weaknesses that may not appear as obvious, but it could really have a detrimental effect on their warfighting capability. I mean, just the fact that they have an army of only sons is like a big problem. In addition to its use for authority, it's basically the problem the Tsarist Empire had. They wanted to be in wars all the time, but they needed a good bit of their army to keep order in their empire. It's almost like that here, but that doesn't mean they won't use it. There's weaknesses, but if they're desperate enough, it doesn't mean they won't take that desperate shot. I mean, Taiwan could be like their new Malvinas. We need oil. Let's go down to Borneo. I mean, whatever it is, they could do. We have our weaknesses too.
We do.
Just the same. And they don't fight wars like we fight wars per se. They try to win them and then fight them. That's the Sun Tzu way, right? We get in a fight and then we're like, how'd we get here and how do we win this? Right? That's how we get involved. They're a little more methodical, but they're still desperate to do things. I can see them taking punches, banking that the international community won't react in a way that maybe it should. If that leads to a misunderstanding, that could really cause some big issues.
Well, you definitely nailed something, that the internal security costs in China. So I've mentioned all these tensions, and I've only kind of talked vaguely about them because it starts to use a lot of Chinese words, and it starts to regions, and it starts we don't know. Yeah, and this is why I don't really. I try to use the least amount of Chinese as possible because I talk to Americans primarily. But in general, the actual internal security costs in China, they spend more on internal security than external defense. That means they spend more on managing and controlling their own people than on preparing to fight the United States or Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam. So you nailed it, that these costs are higher. How much money does the U.S. spend to prevent a civil war in the United States? The federal government, zero. It's all just state police. You don't even need to think about it. Right. Roughly speaking. And how much money does the U.S. military spend to prepare to fight, to defend its territory against Mexico and Canada? Also roughly 0%.
Yeah, I mean.
China's very different. Right. China has, basically more land borders and more borders with any other than any other nation, and half of its, neighbors claim some of its territory. Mm-hmm. So this is a very different situation. So where do you actually fight if you're China? Because I agree with you. The United States has lost its sort of competitive military overmatch against China. That's gone based on especially the anti-access area denial capabilities they've built over the last 15 years in the Western Pacific. That's that ship has sailed. And a lot of, unfortunately, U.S. military strategy to actually deal with a lot of this stuff, it gets to like, well, maybe we just prevent energy shipments from getting to China. And suddenly you're like, well, what are you doing here? Is this a military conflict? It gets kind of dicey. But in general, where does China attack? Like, who do they attack? Because we've talked about this. Who do you lash out against? Like, do you just lash out at, like, the United States, for example, after basically since the Korean War has done all these very, these sort of indirect conflicts. Well, let's go fight communism in this poor Southeast Asian nation to kind of appease France and make sure NATO's okay. That seems like a vague, useless way to kind of go about things, but we're protecting a system. We're fighting an idea. There's a similar thing going on in the Middle East when you're fighting something like, say, terrorism. And I'm not, this is more a criticism of the political calculations that go on to get into these wars, because then you can't get out of them, and you have no political accountability along the way. This has very little to do with the actual military, and the military is not designed for these sorts of conflicts. And it's like, well, if you start redesigning these militaries for these sorts of conflicts, you're hampering your military for real conflicts. So
I absolutely agree with you there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's a political question. And so these military should be used for specific wars with specific goals, Desert Storm or something being a good example. But for China, who do you pick? It's like, you don't have easy targets. You have South Korea. I mean, I don't know what South Korea doesn't make much sense, but nearby South Korea. You have Japan. These aren't like it's not Iraq. You know what I mean? These aren't like easy little. And even Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan makes a lot of sense. Taiwan and Japan are kind of the two that make a lot of sense. You don't start messing with this. What do you do with Russia, India? There's actually not much to do. Throughout Chinese history, there's been very little conflict with India because the Himalayas are such a good border.
Yeah, the geography just doesn't help there.
It doesn't make sense. And then, well, go to Vietnam.
Yeah, they've done that. They've done that. It didn't get
it's like, well, I'm sure the Vietnamese will welcome you with open arms, right? Open arms, yeah. So you tend to look east, and it tends to look east. They want to break out of what's called the first island chain. They want to get access to the broader Pacific. They want to have access also into the South China Sea. But then again, in the Southeast Asia, it's like, well, all right, claim the land of every single island type nation or peninsular nation in the region, and now you just have enemies all around you. It's very tough. And so what's always made the most sense is something like, Japan or Taiwan. And what's recently happened, I actually did a video on this recently. Japan has basically come out right and said, in a conflict over Taiwan, Japan would get involved. And this is where Japan has had 10 years of annual defense budget increases. And it's a major thing. And the defense budget for next year is the largest ever, right? And they're the same way that China has evolved its military policy to specifically thwart U.S. Power projection in the Western Pacific, Japan can do something very similar to China's capabilities to conquer, right? It's actually much easier to prevent China from conquering like Taiwan or an island than a lot of other things. Like I said, the U.S. Navy was able to do that for a long time. It can't do it in the same way anymore. But roughly speaking, if you give Taiwan enough mines and missiles, that is a very hard place to conquer. Like that's, you can make it very complex. People can make this very complex, but just missiles and mines. And it's like the amphibious operations are like the most complex joint ops you can kind of do, and maintaining them to pump millions of gallons of fuel and hundreds of thousands of troops consistently, keep refueling them, supplying them. If you run out of ships, you run out of helicopters, you run out of planes, you run out of landing strips, it's over. You're dead in the water. You got to keep this. You got to conquer, 23 or so million people. It's not easy. Everyone always says, "Oh, China's so big, it'll just crush Taiwan." It's like it ain't that simple.
I'm not saying it'll be easy. I know that China will have difficulties in a lot of things. I believe that. It's just that, especially authoritarian regimes, don't necessarily does what makes sense out of a sense of just I'm going to win, or I'm not going to go down. I'm not going to. Yeah, it's a self-preservation mechanism that kicks it. Like Mussolini, getting involved in half the stuff he did made no damn sense, but he did it. You know what I mean? Hitler invading the Soviet Union made no sense, but he did it. I mean, even Argentina invading the Falklands really made no sense, but they did it. They each have their reasons why they're banking on certain people doing certain things, and it doesn't always play out the way they want it, and it ends bad. But when it ends bad for them, it also affects everyone else around them and even people around the world. I think with China, this might be a possibility too. It don't make sense for them to invade Taiwan or to invade even India, but in my head, maybe they'd try it just out of desperation,
Yeah, I'm saying that they definitely could. And I think Taiwan and Japan are probably the places to look. So people should keep that in mind. And I was just kind of going into some of the nitty gritty because just to give a sense of that their options are bad. You know,
they
what
are
I mean?
bad options. Yeah,
they're bad options for people to invade or places to kind of stick your finger in. And without question, all of this would have huge repercussions. Taiwan in particular, the semiconductor issues the world has been going through is showing how essential Taiwan is to the global system that we basically the modern digital industrial world we live in that makes this podcast possible, makes everything possible. And
save Taiwan for the podcast.
Yeah, right. Save Taiwan or podcasts are going extinct.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Do it for the podcast.
For the pod, right?
Wow. I tell you what, Jason, it's been a good conversation we've had today. A little longer than most of my interviews, but I don't mind. And I'll probably break this up into 2 segments, we can digest this better for the listener. But it was really awesome having you on here today. I love the fact that you've been there, you've seen these things, you have an inside scope that many of us we can only hear about. But you're there, you've seen it, you touched it, you're writing about it. You have your podcast, China Unraveled. China is not the uh, perfect behemoth that it's made out to be. Obviously, it has issues. There's potential problems for everybody all around. But I'll let you close on this thought here. If Jason could have his way in how we politically deal with China from things we can control that perhaps could turn things for the better in China and for the world, what would you do?
So my trajectory on this, I went from at the beginning, this is years ago now, we're talking over 15 years ago. I was like, wow, we got to learn how to potentially deal with this as a threat, as a conflict, as a fight, right? It was sort of a soldier, warrior perspective. And then I started to learn more about China. I was like, oh, whoa, this place might need some help, right? And so then it became a bit more of like healer sort of aid perspective, sort of a salvation story. How do you save this kind of place? Mm-hmm. And then as I learned even more, it became more of not how can we change things or fix things, because I don't think it's possible in China. And I've really tried. I've tried to think about the political system, the economics, all sorts of things that could be done. I do not see a way with current technologies to square this circle. So what I moved to is basically what is the wisdom we can glean from this? And so that is where the deepest benefit of some of the stuff I talk about and the sort of the essence of Chinese civilization I'm trying to communicate to people in the book in particular comes to is what can we learn from this to improve ourselves in society and take what we can from one of the sort of the major civilizations in human history, which is what China is for sure. Whether it becomes global top dog or falls into another chaotic pit is it's part of recurring cycles, but ideally we'd see the whole. So that is kind of what I've focused on. It's more of like, what can we learn? What wisdom can we glean from this? And in particular, a lot of Chinese people, the ethnic Chinese around the world who don't have want a better sense of their history, both sides, the dual side, the chaos, the order and the chaos. Try to provide a bit of that. And for Americans, because, here's an interesting thing. The great martial traditions of the world, most of them come from in and around the North China Plain, this region in northern China that's one of the great battlefields of Earth, of the planet. And so that's one of the weird benefits, not benefit, the sort of outcomes that came with this history and this bloodshed was the origins of basically judo and taekwondo and all the things that spread from Japan, to Japan and South Korea, and that actually do provide a spiritual, integrative, martial benefit to people. And so there's always something from this that we have to take. And that's kind of where I'm going. And so the answer of, well, what would I do to improve things for the world and all that? It's mostly a learning process. And then it's going to be, how do we kind of understand different countries and ourselves and where we can go better? Because I think that we have not only a misunderstanding about what is possible in Iraq or in Russia or in China, we don't understand ourselves. And so what I've been doing is reflecting the United States back and forth with China throughout this process to really get a grip on who we are as a country, as a nation, as a people, and what the strengths and, like you said, what the weaknesses are, and where we can go. Because if things do play out and the risk chessboard of the global world has come to an end,
yes,
and obviously the U.S. could kind of fall off its perch, but that just means it's kind of over in a lot of ways for science, for technology, for keeping the light of consciousness moving forward. However you guys want to think about this, we got to find out what to do to make things better. And so that's kind of what comes next for me. And yeah, if people liked like what I talked about, any of this, you can check out the podcast where I go into different stuff. The book ideally will come out this year. It is super comprehensive. It gives you what I think is a good essence of China to understand it, to know it, and to get the patterns and the cycles and the history and sort of what's valuable and what was horrific, and move forward with it. And then I have a YouTube channel. I do live streams kind of just off the cuff where you hear me mouth off about different things. If people like that, you can definitely check it out. And yeah, look for interviews. And I'm also, this is interesting. I'm going to do a course probably this year, and it's called Map Your World. And it's basically going to describe, the history. It's going to give sort of give people the system that kind of let me, after all this studying all these systems and all this stuff and figuring out a country like China, I'm trying to give people the tools to do that themselves so they can look at history and think, well, maybe it wasn't so weird that Hitler invaded Russia. Maybe the Kaisers end up kind of doing the German general staff did the same thing before. Why does Russia end up doing this? I mean, there's sort of principles kind of embedded actually in geography, in the land and history that can help us understand things on how nations form, who we are, and even basic things like, well, where should I buy a house? And I think that what's happened is globalization and the internet has moved forward is we've lost touch with the ground, like the matrix of history, like the actual planet and things we live on, and all the stuff about the climate is kind of forgetting about the ground level here too. And that's where things can make sense. You can understand China, you can understand the US, and you can understand what's possible and what's not in different countries. And I think that's something really valuable that after doing so many interviews, people keep asking me, actually. That's why I've tried to put this together for people. So check that out. And you can always look at my website, see what I got there. But that is a number of things, all sorts of videos and podcasts for people. And hopefully it's something you guys are interested in.
Jason, it's been really awesome talking with you today, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to the essay segment. I hope you enjoyed this part. This is part 2 with Jason. And if you are hearing this one and you haven't yet heard part 1, I definitely recommend that you go back and listen to that episode to get the complete discussion that Jason and I had. It was a wonderful time. It was longer than most of my interviews. That's why it was broken in half. I could have gladly gone with him probably for a few more hours. But nonetheless, our schedules had to be respected in each direction. And we still got 2 good episodes talking with him with his knowledge of China, which has a good flavor to it because he speaks Chinese. He's lived there. He's worked in China. He's studied in China and went to their schools. He has a good insight to what's going on into that country, what makes it tick, the mindsets and paradigms that they're operating under. Definitely, it's really good to get this feedback because you don't always get this from a lot of sources that want to talk about communist China. For this essay segment here in part 2, I want to talk about a few things, but first I want to definitely hit into modern monetary theory, an economic theory that is quite popular, and of course those who are its advocates love to point to China as the see, look how great it is, example. China's their poster child to explain the greatness of this theory. But I'm still at odds with it. It's a theory that it has a lot of government interaction to spur activity that you can basically, what it comes down to it is you basically rig the numbers so that you can show a good economy. But when you get to the reality on the ground, it may not translate into actual reality. And we talked about that some in the first episode. He talked about it there. We carry it over into this episode again. But basically, the economy in China is by demands, activity goals, the government dictating this is what we want done. All the incentives are twisted incentives, and that's what drives the economic sphere within communist China that they have. And it's different from ours, and I really want to emphasize these differences. If Americans understood what's being asked of them to adopt these philosophical economic approaches to MMT, I want you to fully understand this is what you're getting to replace what you have now. Now, you can complain if you want about our economy's so oppressive and people are bad because of capitalism. And if that's like the rote memory of all you have, okay, please listen to what I have to say real briefly. This is what you're asking for to replace what you have now. In our economy, it's based upon supply and demand, basic economics, supply and demand. economy, as it has been for thousands of years, for the most part, minus the power apparatuses, is based upon this principle. You have something I want to get it. So, I will pay you or trade you or do a service for you to receive that, right? In the beginning, this was the barter system. You have eggs, I have tomatoes. I want eggs and you want tomatoes. So we exchange to get what we want. But of course, that gets troublesome when it's like I have potatoes, you have eggs. I want eggs, but you don't want my potatoes, you want tomatoes. Then I'd have to trade for the tomatoes, then take the potato, and then get the tomatoes, and then go and then get the eggs from you, or maybe vice versa in the opposite direction. So that gets a little lengthy. So something was developed called money. Money, all right? This is basic economic stuff. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. Money is a means of exchange. That's all. It's something taken in exchange to bypass that whole process of getting you what you want so that I can get what I want. Now, that money represents interaction between parties, getting what they want and providing services and providing goods. It's all driven from the demand of the consumer. We have a consumer-oriented society. That's what drives production and services. It's also what drives them up. If you haven't noticed, we don't have a lot of telegraph stations anymore. You know why? Because the demand has sort of, made that go away. We have things like telephones. Now we have smartphones and computers. There's stuff that we would prefer rather than having used a telegraph. So there's the demand for these new things, which the old things tend to kind of fade away. Or you might have maybe there's a few telegraph enthusiasts in the world. I don't know. There could be, but it's not very common. You're probably not going to have a telegraph operator course at your local community college or anything. But nonetheless, that what we get and what our economy produces is based upon what the consumers want. That's the guiding goal. And in the end, here's what happens. Consumers can therefore more availably get what they want than under any other system. That's the ultimate point I want to make to you. Because our economy is consumer driven, that means the economy is geared to give the consumer what they want. Therefore, you have the availability of goods and services that honestly, under different systems, it's not that great. Now, take by example, China's version. Their economy is driven by the vision of the state. And they kind of cooperate with some capitalists because they realized, hey, this top-down communist model really doesn't work. But they won't admit it works. So they go through these cycles where they'll bring in some capitalists who actually know how real economy works, let them kind of fix the problems they started, but then when it gets to the point where, yeah, you're kind of making us look bad with our communist rhetoric, then they clamp back down again. This is their business cycle. Jason mentioned they don't have no business cycles. I see this as their business cycle. They go between this bipolarism of communist theory of economy versus, well, we need the capitalist help, but we won't admit it, sort of thing. And they do these cycles up and down of how much they allow private enterprise to take place and how much the government's going to get the credit for it and do everything. That's their cycles. But in the end, it's all driven by the vision of the party. Yeah, as Jason mentioned, that they don't want the party to end. They don't want it to stop. Of course, the party is who's in charge. They run everything. They get the perks and privileges, despite their claims of egalitarianism. But the fact that this one party exists stops and inhibits actual economic growth, real economy. Because he mentioned cantaloupes, if you remember. There's a shortage of cantaloupes, so they try to do these things to create more cantaloupes. You may or may not get them with the system that they use. See, in the United States, it's like this. Hey, I want a cantaloupe. I'll go buy a cantaloupe. And that's that. Now, if there's no cantaloupes and there's enough people saying, man, we want some cantaloupes, some farmer's going to be like, okay, I'll grow cantaloupes. And boom, at the farmer's market and the grocery stores, the next thing you know, cantaloupes appear, right? If people quit buying cantaloupes, they'll quit growing cantaloupes. If there's this demand, hey, we're running out of cantaloupes, we need more, can you grow more? Guess what? More will be grown. It's all based upon the consumer. Now in China, it's based upon the state. With this MMT mentality, it's based upon these, well, I'm just going to go ahead and say it because it implies the mentality I'm trying to show here. You have these economic geeks in the room, and all they know is numbers, deciding what you need or don't need, right? And I want to do a separate video another time for this to show it in person, but it's sort of like these Sims games. If you've played those, many of you probably have, where you got to build up a city, you got to run its economy, you build this factory or this field or railroad or whatever it is, and you think in your head, I want to build the steel mill or something, right? But then you build it. Boom. That's economic activity, according to the Chinese version, according to MMT. Hey, that's good. It's actual economic activity. We can write that on our numbers, and boom, the economy is soaring. Look at the numbers. But then in reality, like in this, even the game's more honest. What happens is what? You don't have enough iron ore, or you're out of coal. You don't have enough transportation to actually export the steel, right? There's all these problems that suddenly shoot up. If you've played these games, you know what I'm talking about. And it frustrates you. It's like, man, I just wanted steel to be produced. But now everything's, and then you have to go back and keep readjusting these figures until finally you get this thing right. And then it's like, okay, now I need to build this power plant, right? And I can go on and on with this. I think you get the idea. You change one variable in that Sims game and the whole economy collapses on you. And you're like, what's going on? Trying to fix it. That's what it's like to operate an economy from top down. Except in the game, there's very little reflection on people's consumers' desires, their demand. It's all based, that game is still based on numbers. This much of this produces this, which causes this result. And even then, it's like very difficult to manage. Now, when it's a game, it's one thing, but when it's your life and you have people at a distance managing the economy and you're just a piece of it, you're just a number of it, that mess is far more personal to you than it is to the number cruncher or the game maker. I like our economic setup. You can point out faults if you want. There's nothing perfect if humans are involved. But I'm telling you, when I do it by comparison, our system is based upon a simple idea. The consumers get what they're wanting. That's what we want from any economy. If you go to any other version, you're saying what the consumer wants doesn't matter. We're just going to factor in these numbers and make this economy and drive it this way. So like in China, you have all this economic activity, but it's not really doing anything for the people in the economy. They're there to keep the economy propped up. The economy is not there to meet the needs of the people. Now, if that's what you love, if you love some government that you think is going to be on your side, that won't turn on you to stay in power, should just run everything and make everything equal and just produce what we, things we only need or whatever it is your mentality is, and hey, you know what, go for it. But if you kind of like the fact that you can go and just get a burger when you want, if you like the fact that I have multiple stores to pick from, and if I don't like this one, I'll drive over here and get it. If you like the fact that I don't want to go to the store today, I'll just get on Amazon and order it that way. And I'll compare Amazon maybe with Walmart.com, or maybe I'll get a book from Barnes & Nobles rather than Amazon. You have choices. You can pick and choose what you want to use. All that's gone if you switch the mentality from how we see economy versus how those in MMT want to see an economy. Something I strongly advise against. And then you, of course, have the talk that we had with Jason about the internal security that is in China. It's they spend massive amounts of money, like it's a defense industry, to keep everybody in line. And you know what? When you have MMT, you have to. Everything revolves around the people in power calling the shots. And if anyone is contrary to that, they're now an enemy to the economy, among other things, to the party, the economy, to the nation, blah, 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 whatever it is. Anything you do, any expression of freedom you try to demonstrate, well, that makes you basically a traitor to the regime. Is that really what you want? Maybe you think you do. That's because you're making that decision from a position of softness in the United States, where you're spoiled with the goodness of the economy that we have compared to what it could be. And you think that somehow you'll keep that but adopt these other measures. But if you totally change the dynamics of economy, guess what you get? You get the security state. You get the one party that refuses to disappear and forces itself on a nation. You get an economy that does stuff just to do stuff, but it doesn't necessarily make sense. And I'll close with this one example. I lived on a road one time where the Department of Transportation for the state would just do everything out of order, but did it because that was the work order that had to be done. They had the budget to use, and of course, this drives people's jobs and whatnot. It's just an activity, right? So they would do things like fill in the potholes, not very well by that. They'd fill in the potholes, call it a day. But then they would come right behind that, and they would paint the road, redo the lines on the road some months later. And none of this is done like in one day, right? But then after the road is painted, they then come by and then pave over it and pave the whole road over the lines they just painted, and the fact they did is filled in the potholes, right? But then they didn't come behind and put lines on the road again. This is what it looks like when a government runs your economy. That's the best example that has come to my head to show you. If that's what you want on a national scale for your economy, you know what? Enjoy. It's like watching your state crews do the roads. That's how your economy will look. It's like watching the DMV work for you. Yeah, that's how your economy is going to look. And in the end, all that matters is they stay in power and you just fit in where they tell you to fit.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.